There is a building on the corner of 5th Avenue and 34th Street that most Americans have seen in photographs. The Empire State Building. 102 floors of limestone and steel, completed in 1931, and still standing today as one of the most recognized structures on Earth. What almost nobody mentions is what stood there before it. Not farmland, not a vacant lot, a mansion. And inside that mansion, for more than 40 years, one woman held more social power than any elected official in New York City. She was not a politician. She was not a businesswoman in any formal sense. She was a hostess. And in the Gilded Age, that was enough. Her name was Caroline Webster Schermerhorn Astor. History remembers her simply as Mrs. Astor. Not one of the Mrs. Astors, the Mrs. Astor. The distinction mattered enormously to her, and the story of how she claimed that title, defended it, and eventually lost it, is one of the most revealing portraits of American ambition ever recorded. She did not build railroads or accumulate patents. She built something more fragile and more powerful than either. A social order. A hierarchy so carefully constructed that a single invitation from her or the absence of one could define a family's standing for a generation. The Gilded Age produced extraordinary wealth, but it also produced a profound anxiety about what that wealth meant. New money poured into New York from every direction. Families who had made fortunes in railroads, steel, and oil arrived on 5th Avenue and wanted what money alone could not buy. Caroline Astor decided she would be the one to decide whether they got it. This is the story of how she did it, what it cost the people around her, and what it cost her in the end. Chapter 1. The Last Name That Mattered. The list appeared in the New York Times on the 16th of February, 1892. It ran to nearly 300 names: bankers, lawyers, railroad men, the occasional architect. Ward McAllister, the self-appointed master of ceremonies of New York high society, had finally told the press what everyone had been demanding to know for years. These were the 400. The only people in New York who truly mattered. The only people, he declared, who felt at ease in the grandest ballrooms of the city. Behind every name on that list stood one woman who had spent 2 decades deciding who deserved to be there. To understand Caroline Astor, you must first understand what she was before she became an Astor at all. She was born Caroline Webster Schermerhorn on the 22nd of September, 1830, in New York City. Her family were Knickerbockers, the Dutch colonial aristocracy that traced its presence in Manhattan back to the original settlers of New Amsterdam. The Schermerhorns had been in New York for generations before the Revolution. They had built their fortune in shipping, and by the time Caroline was born, her father Abraham was worth approximately $500,000, the equivalent of roughly $15 million today. That was serious wealth. But in the world Caroline grew up in, wealth was almost secondary to the question of where it came from and how long the family had held it. New York, in 1830, was not yet the city it would become. The population hovered around 200,000. The streets above 14th Street were largely farms and open land. The great fortunes of the industrial era had not yet been made, and the social order of the city was still largely governed by families whose names had been attached to Manhattan for 2 centuries. The Schermerhorns sat near the top of that order. They knew the Van Rensselaers, the Livingstons, the Rhinelanders. They did not, notably, know the Astors. The Astor fortune had been built by John Jacob Astor, a German immigrant who arrived in New York in the 1780s with almost nothing. Through fur trading and Manhattan real estate speculation, he made himself the richest man in America. By the time of his death in 1848, His estate was worth approximately $20 million, perhaps $600 million in today's terms. The Astors had wealth on a scale that made almost everyone else look modest. What they did not have, in the eyes of families like the Schermerhorns, was history. This was the central tension of Caroline's world long before she entered it as a public figure. Old New York operated on a strict hierarchy that placed blood and lineage above fortune. The Knickerbockers, those descended from the Dutch and English settlers of the 17th century, regarded the newer fortunes with a polite but unmistakable suspicion. They had survived long enough to accumulate not just wealth, but something rarer, a shared sense of who belonged and who did not. Caroline absorbed this worldview from childhood. It was not snobbery in a simple sense. It was a belief that society required order, that order required standards, and that standards required someone willing to enforce them. When Caroline Schermerhorn married William Backhouse Astor Jr. at Trinity Church in September of 1853, the match was considered advantageous on both sides, but not equally. The Astors received what fortune alone could never purchase: genuine Knickerbocker legitimacy, a bride whose family had been part of New York's social fabric for generations. Caroline received access to one of the largest estates in America. What she did not receive, and what she would spend the next 4 decades constructing for herself, was authority. William Backhouse Astor Jr. was a quiet, largely indifferent man whose primary interest was his yacht, the Nur Mahal. He spent extended periods at sea, away from New York, away from the obligations that consumed his wife. The couple had 5 children, but the household was effectively Caroline's domain from early in the marriage. She was not managing a household, she was building a position. Chapter 2. The Alliance. Ward McAllister wanted to be indispensable. That was, by most accounts, the organizing principle of his life. He had been born in Savannah, Georgia, in 1827, into a respectable but unremarkable legal family, and he had understood from an early age that respectability without distinction was a kind of slow erasure. He studied law, made a modest fortune in California during the gold rush, and then did something that puzzled nearly everyone who knew him. He retired from professional life in his mid-20s and devoted himself entirely to the study of how the wealthy lived. He spent years in Europe, moving through the courts and drawing rooms of England and France, watching and cataloguing. He learned the precise number of courses appropriate for a formal dinner. He learned which wines belonged at which point in an evening. He learned that European aristocracy derived its authority not from wealth alone, but from ritual, and that ritual required constant, meticulous management. When McAllister returned to New York and settled into a modest house that he could barely afford, he brought with him something no amount of inherited money could manufacture: a complete system. He knew exactly what a functioning aristocracy looked like, down to the wording on an invitation. What he lacked was a patron with the standing and resources to implement it. Caroline Astor lacked something different. She had the Schermerhorn name, the Astor fortune, and a husband whose indifference left the entire social calendar in her hands. What she needed was an architect. The two found each other in the early 1870s, and the arrangement they built together was one of the most effective social partnerships in American history. Their instrument was called the Society of Patriarchs. McAllister founded it in 1872 as a committee of 25 men drawn from New York's oldest families: the Van Rensselaers, the Guletts, the Livingstons, and others whose names carried the same Knickerbocker weight as the Schermerhorns. The patriarchs held balls. That sounds modest until you understand what those balls actually were. Invitations were engineered to be difficult to obtain. Each patriarch could invite 4 ladies and 5 gentlemen of his own choosing, and the total capacity was kept deliberately tight. Within 2 seasons, an invitation to a patriarch's ball had become the clearest signal available that a family had been assessed and approved. McAllister managed every detail personally, from the placement of carriages at departure to the precise wording of each card. He could spend 10 minutes debating a single line of an invitation. This was not eccentricity, it was strategy. Caroline presided over this structure as its unspoken sovereign. She did not involve herself in the administrative mechanics. That was McAllister's domain. But her presence at an event conferred a legitimacy that no logistical precision could replicate. McAllister understood this clearly and built the entire apparatus around her. He called her the Mystic Rose, a reference to the figure in Dante's Paradise around whom all of heaven revolves. It was excessive, even by the standards of the era, but it was also accurate as a description of the system they had constructed. Everything rotated around her approval. To get past McAllister, you first had to be the kind of person McAllister believed Caroline would accept. To get past Caroline, you had to have already survived McAllister. The two filters together were nearly impenetrable. For almost 20 years, the partnership held. Then McAllister made the mistake that ended him. In 1890, he published his memoirs under the title Society as I Have Found It. The book was intended as a celebration of everything he and Caroline had built. Instead, it read as a manual, an exposure of the machinery behind the curtain. He named names. He described private rituals. He quantified things that derived their power precisely from being unquantified. Old New York valued discretion above almost everything else, and McAllister had just written a 400-page advertisement for himself, using other people's lives as the content. Caroline withdrew. The families who had been named withdrew. The press, which had tolerated McAllister as a useful source of colour, turned on him with genuine pleasure and christened him Mr. Make-A-Lister. He published the official 400 list in the New York Times in February of 1892, and the backlash was immediate. The list contained only 319 names, not 400. Spouses were omitted. Names were misspelled. People who had died years earlier were included. The document that was meant to be the definitive record of New York society read, on close inspection, like something assembled in haste by a man who had already lost the room. McAllister died in January of 1895, alone at a table in the Union Club, having eaten dinner without company. He was 67 years old. Fewer than 20 members of the 400 attended his funeral. Caroline Astor had a dinner party that evening and did not go. Chapter 3. The Ballroom Test. Every January, on the third Monday of the month, something happened in New York that no law required and no institution enforced, but that carried more practical consequence for certain families than almost anything occurring in Albany or Washington. The invitations arrived, or they did not. Caroline Astor held her annual ball at the Brownstone Mansion on the corner of 5th Avenue and 34th Street, the same address that would one day become the site of the Empire State Building. The house was deceptive. From the street, it read as a plain 4-story brownstone, solid but unremarkable by the standards of the avenue. Inside, the scale shifted entirely. Guests moved through a wide entrance hall into a sequence of 3 connected drawing rooms before reaching the ballroom beyond. The walls carried French tapestries. The furniture was Louis XIV. The chandeliers were crystal. At the far end of the first drawing room, positioned so that every arriving guest would pass directly in front of it, hung a life-size portrait of Caroline herself, painted by the French society painter Carolus Duran in 1890. She stood beneath it in person, receiving each arrival wearing a gown from the Paris atelier of Charles Frederick Worth and a diamond stomacher that had become, over the years, as recognizable as a uniform. The portrait was not vanity. It was architecture. It told every person who entered the room exactly where they stood in relation to the woman before them. You were a guest in her house, beneath her image, on her terms. Worth gowns cost what a working family might earn in several years. Caroline ordered from Paris directly, as did the wealthiest women in Europe, and the customs disputes that occasionally followed when her dresses arrived at New York Harbor were themselves reported in the newspapers. In December of 1890, 2 gowns seized by customs officials ended up at public auction after she refused to pay the penalties assessed on them. The episode was covered as a scandal. It functioned, whether intentionally or not, as a demonstration of the kind of woman she was. She was the sort of person for whom a dress was worth a public confrontation with the federal government. The stakes of the January ball were most acute for debutantes. A young woman making her entrance into society in Gilded Age New York was not simply attending a party. She was being assessed. The connections made, the impression left, the families whose sons she danced with. These determined the shape of her adult life in ways that had nothing to do with her own qualities and everything to do with whether Caroline Astor had decided her family belonged. Mothers began maneuvering for position months in advance. The question was never whether their daughter would enjoy the evening. The question was whether the envelope would arrive at all. Those who received one entered a room of approximately 400 people, the number McAllister had made famous, and which the ballroom had been renovated to accommodate precisely. Those who did not faced something harder to name than embarrassment. In a world where standing was the primary currency of a certain class, exclusion from the Astor Ball required no explanation. The absence of an envelope said everything. Caroline managed this power with deliberate restraint. She did not explain her decisions. She did not negotiate. She received her arrivals, moved through the evening with the courtesy of someone who had long since stopped needing to prove anything, and by midnight it was over. The season would continue. Teas, dinners, Newport in the summer. But nothing else carried the weight of that single January evening. Chapter 4. The Children She Played. Caroline Astor had 5 children, and she treated the fact of them the way she treated most things in her life, as material to be managed. Emily, Helen, Charlotte, Caroline, and John Jacob IV were born between 1856 and 1864, into a household that was run less like a home and more like a small court. The children lived on the upper floors with their nurses and governesses. Their mother operated on the floors below. The division was architectural, but it was also a statement of priorities. The daughters were educated, presented, and married, according to a logic that had almost nothing to do with their own preferences and everything to do with the alliances their matches would secure. Emily married James Van Allen, a name with the right Knickerbocker resonance. Charlotte married a Drayton. Helen, the second daughter, married into the Roosevelt family, a connection that carried genuine social weight. These were not love matches in any primary sense. They were transactions conducted with the same careful attention Caroline brought to her guest lists, and the daughters appear to have understood this as simply the condition of their lives. Helen was the one who broke. She died in 1893 at the age of 34, and the reported cause was an overdose of laudanum. The circumstances were handled with the discretion that old New York applied to everything it did not wish to examine directly. There was no scandal in the newspapers, no public inquiry. Helen Roosevelt was mourned and buried, and largely not spoken of again. Caroline had lost her husband the previous year, and now her daughter within months. She continued her social calendar. The youngest daughter, Carrie, was different from her siblings in one significant respect. She wanted what her mother had. Not the fortune or the position exactly, but the centrality, the sense of being the person around whom things organized themselves. This made her useful to Caroline in ways the other children were not, and it also made her vulnerable in ways Caroline either did not see or did not consider relevant. That vulnerability would be exposed by someone else entirely, and it would cost Caroline something she had never expected to surrender. The only son, John Jacob Astor IV, known to everyone as Jack, was by the early 1890s becoming a figure in his own right. He was wealthy independently of his mother, reasonably intelligent, and possessed of the restless energy that often accompanies inherited fortune with no obvious purpose. He built things, an experimental bicycle road, an atmospheric projector for the Columbian Exposition. He wrote a science fiction novel. He was also, in social terms, entirely his mother's instrument when she needed him to be, and entirely his own problem when she did not. His story was not finished yet, but it was already in motion. Chapter 5. The Vanderbilt Gambit. The invitations went out in the early weeks of 1883, and New York talked about almost nothing else. Alva Vanderbilt was throwing a costume ball to celebrate the completion of her new mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue, a Gothic chateau that occupied a full city block between 51st and 52nd Streets. Richard Morris Hunt had designed it. The construction had taken years and cost approximately $3 million. The guest list ran to 1,200 names. It was, by every measure available, the most ambitious private entertainment the city had ever seen. Carrie Astor had been rehearsing for weeks. She and a group of friends had prepared a quadrille, a group dance intended as one of the evening's set pieces. The rehearsals had gone well. The costuming was arranged. Then the invitations arrived for everyone in the group except her. Alva Vanderbilt's explanation, when it was sought, was delivered with the precision of someone who had prepared it carefully. She had no address for Mrs. Astor, she said, because Mrs. Astor had never called upon her at her new home. Until that call was made, there was no basis for an invitation. The logic was unimpeachable, because it was Caroline's own logic turned back on her. Calling on a household was the foundational ritual of the world she had spent 15 years constructing. You called. They returned the call. Only then did a relationship exist. By never calling on Alva Vanderbilt, Caroline had, by her own rules, declared the Vanderbilts invisible. Alva had simply made the consequences of that declaration visible to Caroline's daughter. Caroline left her calling card at 660 Fifth Avenue shortly afterward. The invitation followed. On the evening of March 26, 1883, carriages began arriving at 10 as crowds gathered on the pavement outside to watch. Police had been deployed to manage the traffic. Guests arrived in costumes that had consumed months of planning and sums that strained credibility. Alva herself appeared as a Venetian princess. Her sister-in-law, Alice Vanderbilt, wore a white satin dress wired for electric current and studded with glass beads in a lightning pattern, powered by a battery concealed in the gown. The press called it the electric light costume. The photographer, Jose Maria Mora, had been engaged to document the evening, and his portraits of the guests survive as the only known photographs taken inside a Gilded Age costume ball. The total cost of the evening was reported at approximately $250,000. Champagne alone accounted for $65,000. The dancing continued until sunrise. Ward McAllister was there. Caroline Astor was there. By the time the last carriage left Fifth Avenue, the Vanderbilts were inside the 400, and everyone present understood that the boundary Caroline had maintained for over a decade had been crossed permanently. She had not been defeated by force. She had been defeated by someone who had learned her rules better than she had anticipated. The Vanderbilts received their invitation to the Astor Ball the following January. The matter was considered settled. Chapter 6. The Title War. In 1890, John Jacob Astor III died, and his son William Waldorf Astor inherited the senior branch of the family fortune. William Waldorf was educated, well-travelled, and deeply aggrieved. He had served as American minister to Italy, written historical novels, and accumulated a level of cultural refinement that he felt went entirely unappreciated in New York. What aggravated him most was a matter of nomenclature. His Aunt Caroline had been calling herself Mrs. Astor for years, printing the title on her calling cards without qualification, as though she were the only Mrs. Astor in existence. William Waldorf believed that distinction belonged to his wife, Mamie. He was now the head of the senior Astor line. His wife was therefore the senior Mrs. Astor. The argument was genealogically defensible. Caroline ignored it entirely. What followed was one of the more creative acts of revenge in the history of New York real estate. William Waldorf owned the mansion directly adjacent to Caroline's home on 33rd Street, the property where his father had lived. In 1892, he announced that he was tearing it down. In its place, he would build a hotel. Not a modest hotel. A 13-story hotel in the German Renaissance style, designed by Henry Janeway Hardenberg, with 450 guest rooms and 15 public rooms and a footprint that would sit directly against the wall of Caroline's home. The noise of construction would be considerable. The foot traffic, once the hotel opened, would be considerable. The general atmosphere of a busy commercial establishment, pressing against the side of her brownstone, would be, William Waldorf calculated, intolerable. He was correct on all counts. The Waldorf Hotel opened on the 13th of March, 1893. Caroline is reported to have described it as a glorified tavern next door, which was widely repeated and almost certainly accurate as a reflection of her views. She endured the situation for several years before accepting what had become obvious. The neighborhood was finished as an address for people like her. The old residential enclave around 34th Street and 5th Avenue was being overtaken by commerce, and no amount of social authority could reverse a zoning reality. Caroline and her son Jack responded with the only instrument available to them: more construction. They demolished Caroline's own brownstone and commissioned Hardenberg again, the same architect William Waldorf had used, to build a 16-story hotel on the site. They called it the Astoria. It opened in 1897, taller than the Waldorf, with 550 guest rooms and a grand ballroom in the Louis XIV style. The two hotels now stood side by side on Fifth Avenue, monuments to a family argument about a title on a calling card. The resolution was characteristically American. Business interests overrode personal hostility. The two hotels were connected by a 300-foot interior corridor of amber marble that quickly acquired the nickname Peacock Alley because the guests who promenaded through it tended toward display. The combined Waldorf Astoria became the largest hotel in the world and one of the most famous addresses on Earth. Caroline and Jack had already moved uptown by then, into a new double mansion on the corner of 65th Street and 5th Avenue, designed by Richard Morris Hunt, faced in limestone, and large enough that the old brownstone on 34th Street felt, in retrospect, like a rehearsal. The site of that brownstone, and of the Waldorf Astoria itself, was cleared in 1929. The Empire State Building opened on the same ground 2 years later. Chapter 7. Beachwood. Newport, Rhode Island had been a summer retreat for wealthy Americans since before the Civil War. By the 1870s, it had become something more specific. the place where the families who mattered went when New York's social season ended, and where the competition that animated that season continued without pause under different conditions. The air was cooler. The setting was the Atlantic coastline. The stakes were not. Caroline and William Backhouse Astor purchased Beachwood in 1880, paying just under $200,000 for an Italianate villa on Bellevue Avenue that had originally been built for a clothing merchant named Daniel Parrish. The house sat on a promontory above the Cliff Walk, a public footpath running along the edge of the Newport shoreline, close enough that anyone walking the path could look directly into the grounds of the wealthiest families in America. This was not considered a problem by the owners. It was considered appropriate. Beachwood, as purchased, was adequate. Caroline did not operate in the register of adequate. Between 1888 and 1890, she commissioned Richard Morris Hunt to undertake a comprehensive renovation at a cost of $2 million. Hunt enlarged the dining room to seat 200 guests around a single table. He added a music room with wallpaper imported from Paris. He built a loggia along the south and east faces of the house, overlooking the Cliff Walk. Most importantly, he added a ballroom. It was built to hold exactly 400 guests. The number was not a coincidence. Beachwood became the summer counterpart to the 34th Street mansion, the place where Caroline received, assessed, and either confirmed or quietly declined the positions of the families around her. The rhythms differed from New York. Afternoons on the water, carriage processions along Bellevue Avenue, dinner parties that began late and ran later. But the underlying calculus was unchanged. An invitation to Caroline Astor's table at Beachwood carried the weight it carried anywhere else she presided. Only the season had changed. Then, Alva Vanderbilt built Marble House. The timing, in 1892, was not accidental. The site Alva chose was on Bellevue Avenue, close enough to Beachwood that the comparison was inescapable. Hunt drew the plans, the same architect Caroline had used for her renovations, and the result was a structure that made Beachwood look restrained by any measure. Marble House cost $11 million, used 500,000 cubic feet of marble, and contained a ballroom finished in gilded bronze that operated at a scale of deliberate excess. Alva had already forced Caroline's hand in New York 9 years earlier. In Newport, she used the same instrument, a building. Caroline did not renovate in response. Beachwood was not competing with Marble House on architectural terms, and she knew it. What Beachwood offered was not spectacle, but continuity. It had been the center of Newport society before Marble House existed, and Caroline's position there rested on something a newer and larger building could not simply purchase. That said, the arrival of Vanderbilt money on Bellevue Avenue accelerated a process already underway. Newport was changing. The exclusivity that had defined it was softening, and the summer court Caroline had presided over was beginning, very slowly, to belong to a different kind of person. Chapter 8. The Slow Fade. The first sign was not a scandal. It was something quieter and harder to argue with. By the mid-1890s, certain hostesses in New York had begun throwing parties on their own terms without seeking approval from anyone. Mamie Fish, wife of the railroad financier Stuyvesant Fish, was among the first to do it openly. She had a talent for entertainment that owed nothing to formality and everything to irreverence. She shortened dinners from the accepted 2 hours to 50 minutes, on the grounds that the food was not the point. She invited performers, eccentrics, people who made the room unpredictable. She once staged a dinner party in honor of a guest who turned out to be a chimpanzee in evening dress. The newspapers loved her. The old guard did not know what to do with her. Caroline Astor, who had built an entire system on the proposition that society required gravity and gatekeeping, watched a younger woman dismantle that proposition, one outrageous evening at a time. Mamie Fish was not alone. Teresa Fair Ulrichs and Alva Belmont, who had by then divorced William Kissam Vanderbilt and remarried, formed alongside Fish what observers began calling the triumvirate, three women who collectively redefined what a New York hostess could be. They were louder, faster, and considerably less interested in whether their guest lists met genealogical standards. The order Caroline had built with such deliberation was not collapsing. It was being made to look beside the point. Against this, the personal losses accumulated. William Backhouse Astor Jr. died in Paris in 1892, leaving Caroline a widow at 61. The following year, her daughter Helen, who had married into the Roosevelt family, died at 34. The reported cause was an overdose of laudanum. As noted in an earlier chapter, the circumstances were handled with the discretion that certain families applied to things they did not wish to examine, and Helen was buried without public comment. 2 deaths in consecutive years, a husband and a daughter, and Caroline continued her calendar. She kept moving because stopping was not something she had ever practiced. McAllister's death in January of 1895 closed something that had ended with his memoirs years before. He had been the mechanism by which her decisions were implemented and enforced. Without him, the administrative architecture of the 400, weakened by his publications, had no one to maintain it. The Social Register, a privately published directory of acceptable families that had first appeared in 1886, was quietly absorbing the function McAllister had performed in person. A list in a book required no dinner parties, no patriarchs, no debated invitations. It simply existed, updated annually, and anyone could consult it. The personalized judgment that had been Caroline's primary instrument was being replaced by a printed index. She kept going. The new mansion on 65th Street was larger and more imposing than the brownstone on 34th Street had ever been. She entertained through the late 90s and into the early 1900s, and her January ball continued to draw guests who understood what an invitation represented, even if the city outside the ballroom had changed. But the influence she had exercised at her peak, the period historians would later place as running roughly from the early 1870s to 1891, was not recoverable. The people who came now came out of habit and respect for what she had been. That is a different thing from coming because you have no choice. Chapter 9. The Queen Who Wouldn't Leave. The servants set the table. They had their instructions and they followed them. The correct number of place settings, the flowers arranged, the crystal in position. The guests Caroline Astor was expecting that evening did not exist. They had not existed for some time. Her mind, in the final years of her life, had begun retreating into a version of the past that was vivid and complete and entirely her own. She held dinner parties for people who were not there. She received guests in the drawing room who had no flesh. The staff of the mansion on 65th Street dressed the table and served the courses and maintained the forms of the household because that was what they had been asked to do, and because there was no dignified alternative. The timeline of her decline is difficult to establish, precisely because those around her worked to obscure it for as long as possible. What is documented is that by the early 1900s, her grip on the present had become intermittent. She spoke of people who had been dead for years, as though they were expected shortly. At one point, she became convinced she was pregnant and began making arrangements for a nursery in the mansion. She fell down the marble staircase sometime in her final years. Servants found her on the floor at the bottom of the stairs, her white hair matted with blood. She recovered physically. The fall marked something else. In 1908, she gave an interview to a reporter from the Delineator, a women's magazine. and spoke about her role in New York society with the confidence of someone whose position had never been in question. She acknowledged her age without conceding anything to it. She told the reporter that she was not vain enough to believe New York could not manage without her, and that many women would rise to fill her place. It was a measured and gracious thing to say. It was also a statement made by a woman who did not fully understand how completely that process had already occurred. She died on the 30th of October, 1908, at the mansion on 65th Street, of heart failure. She was 78 years old. Her son Jack had been at her bedside earlier that day with his young wife. Her daughter Carrie was the only one present at the end. The funeral was held in the mansion itself, and she was buried beside her husband in the Astor Mausoleum at Trinity Cemetery on West 153rd Street. Carrie erected a 40-foot stone cross at the cemetery in her mother's memory in 1914. It stands there still. What followed her death completed the dismantling of everything she had spent her life assembling. It took 3 women, Mamie Fish, Teresa Ulrichs, and Alva Belmont, working together to approximate what she had done alone. Jack Astor, her only son, died in April of 1912, when the Titanic sank in the North Atlantic. He was the wealthiest passenger aboard. The mansion on 65th Street was sold by her grandson, Vincent, in 1926, and demolished shortly after. The Waldorf Astoria, that monument to family spite and unlikely collaboration, was torn down in 1929 to make way for the Empire State Building. The 400 dissolved as a meaningful concept sometime in the years after the First World War, when the social order that had given it teeth ceased to exist in any recognizable form. What remains is the portrait. Carolus Duran's painting of Caroline Astor, completed in 1890, hangs in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. She is standing. She is wearing the diamond stomacher. She is looking at whoever stands in front of her with an expression that does not invite interpretation. For 40 years, the most powerful room in New York was the one where that expression greeted you at the door. The room is gone. The expression is not.